Okay, yeah, so in this presentation, I'll focus especially on how we can account for different levels of decision-making in agent-based models and potential trade-offs that we can use these models to identify. So this is really motivated by two common challenges that I and the teams I've worked with have previously experienced in our own efforts, and I think we can fairly comfortably say are common challenges across migration modeling. So one is accounting for adaptive policymaking. So often when we account for policymakers in models, we account for it kind of as exogenous scenarios. We do these what-if experiments, like what if there was this insurance policy, or what if there was this cash transfer policy, or what if there was this border policy? And that's a great start and very useful. But also we know in the real world that policymakers can keep updating their actions, right, in response to what they see. And also that process can be very messy. There's a lot of contestation between different ministries. There might be time lags in terms of signals to when policies actually get implemented. So we want to see how does accounting for this affect kind of what we see in terms of migration responses through these models. A second common challenge is that there's multiple levels of governance in most political systems. So there might be kind of local scale decision makers reacting to national level policies. Sometimes those objectives might be in accordance with each other. Sometimes they might actually be very divergent. And I think more often than not, there are kind of implicit trade-offs where we don't see those trade-offs initially, but when we play out kind of the responses of policymakers to each other, we can identify some trade-offs. And so the team and I are looking at this in the context of climate adaptation and migration in Nepal. As most of you probably know, Nepal is highly vulnerable to climate shocks. It's a high source of out-migration, so remittances account for 1/4 of the GDP. It's also still highly agricultural dependent. And politically, what makes it a very important case study is that in 2015, there was a new constitution that devolves powers, so it's a much more federal system than it used to be. So competencies for things like migration and agricultural policy are still being worked out. So our main questions are, do predicted migration rates differ substantially when we account for local institutions' response? How do sources of what we call endogenous uncertainty, so things like policy lags or different policy goals, how does uncertainty there for different decision-making agents affect their ability to meet their objectives? And then more broadly, connecting to the polycentric governance literature, what principles of polycentric governance can help increase policy robustness to exogenous uncertainty? So things like climate shocks or macroeconomic shocks. And conversely, do some principles actually increase fragility? I'll mostly focus just on the first question for the next few minutes, but I'm happy to chat further about the others. So one of the first things we did is to try to map out the decision-making space. Of course, it's much more complex than even this diagram, but what we wanted to see is who are some of the key decision makers in green? What are some of their levers, either policies or kind of livelihood decisions they can push and pull on in blue? What are the stocks they pay attention to in yellow? And then some of the key exogenous uncertainties in orange. And just to say that in previous work, we developed an agent-based model really focusing on that farmer household decision-making scale. So what are the things like livelihood choices, migration choices, things like purchasing insurance? And we assumed kind of the rest of the world was exogenous. What we want to do now is embed some of those other decision makers into the model. So looking at how do village development councils make decisions based on what they see. You know, they might want to subsidize agricultural inputs, for instance. National ministries might want to commercialize the agricultural sector. So what kind of policies do they implement in reaction to what they see? So just with the remaining time, I'll just go through a couple of key results. So first, we wanted to look at how do livelihood choices change based on the types of policies we're assuming. So in this first kind of graph, we show households' livelihood changes or choices in the Chitwan district, one of the main agricultural regions. And so here we're showing kind of subsistence crops, so the proportion of households farming subsistence crops in green, the households that are switching to kind of more cash crops, more high expense but high reward cash crops in purple, and the households that pursue migration in blue. And so what we can see is that in base case, without policy interventions, households gradually diversify their livelihood choices to include more cash crops. More households end up migrating gradually as they start accumulating more resources and as they get more information from their neighbors. Because I should mention also in our model, we have kind of boundedly rational households that need kind of information about different livelihood opportunities. So when we account for the effect of crop insurance, so national crop insurance program, so this is a key objective from the national kind of agricultural ministry that they want to accelerate the commercialization of agriculture. So we see that one of the things they're experimenting with is index-based crop insurance. And when we account for this in the model, we do see a pretty stark effect of more households pursuing cash crops and slightly less households engaging in migration, because now those cash crops are enough for many households to kind of meet their income goals. What's interesting is that this might run counter to some local policymaker objectives. So We've started reviewing some local adaptation plans of action in Nepal. And one of the key themes that comes out of that is the importance from local policymakers of relying on a local food self-sufficiency. So trying to meet more and more of their caloric needs through local production. And so one goal that was cited is meeting 50% of one's caloric needs, of a region's caloric needs through local production of cereal crops. And so here we show in the model what would happen. So the gold is kind of the target production to meet that goal of 50% of your local needs. And then red is the actual local production of cereal crops, accounting for things like outmigration, climate shocks, et cetera. So we can see that actually the local production is much lower than what the local policymaker would like. And so we can build in an endogenous response where the local policymaker would subsidize more production of cereal crops. And so here we see that that has an effect. More households stick with kind of cereal crops, less households diversify to cash crops. And in response, indirectly, more households end up migrating because that ends up being the most attractive way to increase income rather than switch to cereal crops. And so finally, we can see these policies in combination, what impact that has on kind of migration rates and who migrates. And so here we're showing in the bar graph the overall migration proportion of the community, and then broken down by households' educational status. So we base this off of census data, and we link that to things like risk aversion, access to information, and resources. And so we can see that if we look at base case with no temperature change versus a 1.5 C increase, there's actually very little change in outmigration. But if we account for kind of that national insurance program, we see much lower migration rates. And then when we account for local policy responses, we actually see that migration rates might counter the effect of that insurance policy or even increase migration compared to the base case. And most interestingly, I think, is it's really the most vulnerable households, that green bar of kind of households with only primary educational attainment, that are most susceptible to policy effects. And so just to summarize, we saw different endogenous policy responses might lead to different adaptation pathways. Migration rate might differ substantially based on assumed policy responses, and that top-down consequences or policies might lead to unintended consequences, which highlights the need for cross-scale coordination. There's lots of stuff that's not in the model that we'd love to keep doing, expanding the set of policy interventions, endogenizing the national policymaker response, and then ultimately with the goal of testing how are different arrangements robust or not to exogenous uncertainty. So I'm happy to chat further. Thanks for your attention, and looking forward to more discussion.